This is Talking Foreign Policy, a critical look at Canada's role abroad. And I am Eve Engler. Today, Justin Trudeau announced that he was resigning as leader of the Liberal Party. He's prorogued Parliament or suspended Parliament until March 24th and will stay on as Prime Minister until a new Liberal leader is selected. Over the past 15 months, many have been appalled by Trudeau's role in enabling Israel's Holocaust in Gaza. Before becoming prime minister, Trudeau had already declared himself a Zionist. His chief fundraiser was Stephen Bronfman, who boasted back in 2013 to the Globe and Mail that Trudeau was more pro-Israel than Stephen Harper. Prior to the last 15 months, Trudeau government expanded the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement, appointed Erwin Kotler as special envoy to protect Israel from criticism, called on the International Court of Justice to reject the UN General Assembly's request for an advisory opinion on states' legal responsibilities vis-a-vis Israel's occupation. Over the past 15 months, we've seen that Trudeau has maintained intelligence assistance, continues the military mission in the West Bank, Operation Proteus, has continued the major Canadian subsidy through registered charities to Israel, and has defended Israel on many occasions. For instance, on the eve of South Africa presenting its case to the International Court of Justice against Israel's genocide, Trudeau posted a message to X with Israeli flags in the background and boasted about Canada's, quote, unwavering commitment to that country. More recently, they've listed a grassroots solidarity group, Samidoun Palestinian Political Prisoners Network, as a terror organization. They've defended Israel's wars on Lebanon, Yemen, Iran bombings. They failed. They promised to restart diplomatic relations with Iran and failed to do so. In fact, recently listed the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Iranian military, as a terror organization. When Trudeau won, I personally wasn't expecting a major shift from Stephen Harper's foreign policy, but I have to say Trudeau's been worse than expected. Today, we have two guests to discuss a decade of Justin Trudeau's foreign policy as pro-US empire and pro-corporate foreign policy. To start off with, we have Owen Schalk, who is the co-author of Canada's Long Fight Against Democracy and author of Canada in Afghanistan, a story of military, diplomatic, political, and media failure 2003 to 2023. Thanks a lot for coming on Talking Foreign Policy, Owen. Could you start off with talking about maybe a little bit of an obscure element of Trudeau's foreign policy, but I think an important one because of all this rhetoric about supporting democracy? Can you talk about Trudeau's role in the coups in Bolivia in 2019 and Peru more recently?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just start by saying that when Canada supports these coups, it's always in favor of corporate interests and then the expansion of Canadian capital. So the ability of Canadian capital to extract as much value as possible from these countries in the form of labor or export markets or raw materials. That's what it's all about. And that's why Trudeau so eagerly supported these overthrows of government in Bolivia and in Peru. And to start with Bolivia, just because it came first, this was a coup that Canada had direct involvement in, including through the Canadian role in the OAS electoral audit, and also through the Trudeau government's spreading of false claims about election fraud committed by the ruling MAS party under Evo Morales. So Canada helped to finance this OAS audit mission, and there were Canadian technical advisors who served on it. And basically, what the audit claimed was that because of a pause in the vote count on election night in 2019, which an election which Evo Morales won, because of that pause, which was then followed by a surge in votes for the MAS party, the OAS audit claimed that this was a clean-cut case of electoral fraud, even though those votes came from the rural mountainous areas where Morales had the highest level of support. So they took longer to gather and to tally, and that accounted for the pause. And this was proven by later investigations. But after that OAS election audit came out, on which Canadian advisors served, in which Canada helped to finance, After this comes out, you had Chrystia Freeland champion the findings. She released a statement, for instance, saying, quote, Canada welcomes the results of the OAS electoral audit mission in Bolivia. Canada commends the invaluable work of the OAS audit mission in ensuring a fair and transparent process, which we supported financially and through our expertise. Meanwhile, publicly, the Trudeau government also did its best to delegitimize Morales and to legitimize the racist right-wing coup government of Janine Áñez, whose party had only won 4% of the vote in 2019. And she had seized power after Morales fled for his life and ended up exiled in Mexico. Global Affairs Canada said that they refused to acknowledge the results of the election. You had Trudeau talking about supposed election irregularities in Bolivia. And during the Áñez government, Ottawa was silent as the Bolivian government massacred protesters, including in the cities of Sacaba and Sencata, who were protesting, for new elections and for the removal of this illegitimate government. And I would just say that Canada, doesn't have particularly sizable investments in Bolivia, as far as I know, unlike in Peru. But Bolivia still represented, in a way, the threat of a bad example. The threat of resource nationalism in Latin America, which can always gain popularity and spread. So I would say that was probably the major reason behind Trudeau's support for that coup. And then there's Peru in 2022. The year before, you had this shock victory of Pedro Castillo, who was a member of a Marxist party, elected in a country that had a history of being governed by the very extreme right. And Castillo's victory upset the whole system. And during his time in power, the entrenched elite in Peru, which has historically been aligned with Washington and Ottawa, they made sure he couldn't govern. You actually had the military forcing Castillo to remove ministers that he'd appointed, and Canada said nothing about this. And, of course, Castillo was largely ineffective in his efforts to circumvent these obstructions. But he was talking about doing good things like reforming the neoliberal constitution. He was talking about agrarian reform. And in the case of Peru, there are many Canadian mining companies with huge investments there. And they didn't like what they were hearing out of the Castillo government at all. And by extension, neither did Trudeau and his people, because Trudeau and his people are essentially representatives for these companies in Latin America. So then when Castillo goes for this power grab that would allow him to implement his agenda, he's totally outmaneuvered by the military, he's imprisoned, and then there's this furious public backlash against his overthrow. There's months of protest. The Peruvian military cracks down with extreme violence. They shoot hundreds of people, they kill dozens, and it should be said that this new government is way, way less popular than Castillo was, but Trudeau helps to legitimize it as well, just as his government did in Bolivia with Janine Áñez. Just a week after Castillo was removed, you had Canadian officials voicing their support for the coup government, including the Canadian ambassador to Peru and Foreign Affairs Minister Joly. And while all this is going on, Trudeau is attending international meetings about the importance of democracy and the fight against authoritarianism and all that. But his government, they openly took a side in this conflict in Peru, and this pitted Trudeau against much of the Western Hemisphere, because you had many countries refusing to acknowledge the legitimacy of the Peruvian government under Dina Boluarte. And that included Mexico, Argentina, Bolivia, Colombia, Cuba, Nicaragua, Honduras, Venezuela, and many Caribbean countries. Instead, Canada sided with the US, with Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, and with Guillermo Lasso in Ecuador, who was one of the most unpopular presidents in that country's history. That is who Trudeau sided with against the popular movements in Peru. He sided with the Peruvian right, and he sided with the Canadian mining industry.
So they clearly don't care much for democracy despite their rhetoric, and they don't care much for dealing with inequalities, because these are countries that are, governments trying to overcome whatever issues they had, trying to overcome some deep inequalities in Bolivia and Peru. Can you talk a little bit about a campaign that was even more extensive, and that's Canada's role under the Trudeau government in trying to overthrow Venezuela's government?
Yeah, so like you say, the Trudeau government's longest and most involved coup attempt was against the Venezuelan government, and that was done through the Lima Group, which was this anti-Bolivarian coalition of right-wing Latin American governments that Canada helped to form and then participated in. It was done through sanctions. It was done through a nonstop campaign of vilification against the Venezuelan government, in which the Canadian media played a vital role. And it was done through actual on the ground organizing of the Venezuelan opposition. You had officials in the Trudeau government bragging about this, and we quote them in our book, Eve, talking about how, they're putting so much effort into rallying the opposition behind this pretender, Juan Guaido. And not only that, the Trudeau government endorsed Lima Group declarations that openly called for a military coup against Maduro. Trudeau would raise the issue of Venezuela in bilateral meetings with other countries that had nothing to do with the issue, like Japan. And anti-government civil society groups in Venezuela, they received funding and support from the Canadian government. So this was a very coordinated effort, and it was the most coordinated coup attempt that occurred under Trudeau. I think it was really more comparable to the 2004 coup in Haiti or the 2014 coup in Ukraine. Both of those were successful. This one wasn't, but they're similar in terms of scale and resources that Canada threw behind this coup attempt. The Trudeau government inserted itself into the forefront of the anti-Venezuela coalition. It did everything it could to destabilize Venezuela, to empower anti-government forces, and to harm as many Venezuelans as possible through sanctions. Because you had tens of thousands of Venezuelans dying due to deprivation that was imposed on them by sanctions. And at the same time, Chrystia Freeland was calling for sanctions with, quote, more bite. It was such an atrocious policy. And it should be stressed, too, that this policy was a continuation and even an expansion of Harper's policy toward Venezuela. And in many ways, it was even more aggressive. And Harper was very anti-Chavez. He released a statement celebrating Chavez's death in 2013. He funneled money to Sumate, this anti-Chavez NGO that was pretty tireless in its efforts to overthrow the Venezuelan government. Trudeau picked up Harper's mantle and he continued the destabilization efforts, and he intensified them to such a degree that now Canada's name will forever be inseparable from the imperialist efforts to destroy Venezuela's economy and overthrow the government there.
And you touched on this a bit, but maybe just a little bit more. So in Latin America, a big part of Canada's policy is structured around advancing mining interests. Can you talk a little bit about this, the Trudeau government? They made this big promise that the civil society had been campaigning for many years. So before being elected, Trudeau promised to bring in an ombudsperson that would end public support for Canadian mining companies found to be involved in significant abuses abroad. And they initially said they were going to do that, and then they basically, under pressure from the mining sector, they completely watered down this position. Can you talk just a little bit about the sort of mining question and the broken promise on the ombudsperson?
Yeah, for sure. So I said earlier that Canadian foreign policy is designed to help Canadian companies extract as much value as possible from the world market, and especially from these periphery countries. And the mining industry is central to that. Canada's home to half the world's mining and mineral exploration companies. And around the world, they are complicit in extrajudicial killings, environmental degradation, intimidation of community leaders, and collaboration with the militaries of very repressive governments. And recently I visited Guatemala and I spoke to people who live near Canadian mines about their experiences, and their encounters with these Canadian mining companies are just harrowing. And, mining and the unaccountability of that industry, as you say, it's an issue that Canadians have long organized around, and they've tried to draw attention to and tried to force the Canadian government to rein in these companies. But that's a constant uphill struggle because the Canadian state, as I said earlier, it acts as a representative of these companies and it promotes their interests around the world, including in Guatemala, where I saw those devastating impacts firsthand. So, yeah, some people watching or listening, they might remember that mining watchdog that Trudeau created, the Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise, or the CORE. People, activists, social movements, they've been calling for the creation of something like that for years, a watchdog with the power to investigate abuses committed by Canadian multinationals abroad. And Trudeau comes to power in 2015. He promises to create this office, and he delays for 4 years before finally creating the core. And it's totally powerless because it's not able to compel Canadian companies to hand over information or give testimony. So it can't investigate these companies unless they're willing to be investigated. And shortly after, he creates this watchdog. The union and NGO representatives who are advising the core, they all resign because they weren't able to do anything and the government was ignoring all of their complaints. And then finally, last year, the core announced that it was investigating companies for abuses abroad. And they were companies that did business in China. You know, not Guatemala, a country that has been devastated by Canadian mining, but China. So the core was ostensibly created to keep these Canadian companies in check, but it's been totally co-opted now into this new Cold War logic. And it's being utilized to further demonize China instead of holding Canadian companies accountable. It's ridiculous. And I'll just end my answer by saying that this issue of the toothless mining watchdog, it's directly related to Trudeau's participation in various coups around the world because it's done for the same ends. Whether it's preventing the creation of an industry watchdog or rendering that watchdog meaningless after it's created, or if it's participation in subversion and destabilization efforts against leftist governments, Ottawa always seeks to assist Canadian multinationals in extracting as much as possible from the countries it invests in. And Justin Trudeau's almost decade in office, it was no exception to that at all.
Yeah, that is certainly the unfortunate case. Now, shifting gears a little bit in terms of policy direction from Latin America coups and this pro-mining policy to its military policy and its the Trudeau government's position on NATO and arms spending. And there's this perception that Trudeau, if you read the media, the big media, that they're not spending enough money on the military, and there's a lot of we're not upholding our responsibilities to NATO and this kind of discussion. So there's this perception out there. To discuss a little bit of the actual facts of Trudeau's military policy, we have Tamara Lorincz, who is a well-known anti-war environmental activist for many decades. She's currently a PhD candidate at the Basili School of International Affairs. So thanks for coming on Talking Foreign Policy again, Tamara. But can you just talk about the actual numbers? Start off with the actual numbers from 2014 to today in Canadian military spending.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me again, Eve. So when Trudeau came in with his majority Liberal government in 2015, military spending at that time was $20 billion. But if you look at the latest NATO Defense Expenditures report, last year, 2024, it was $41 billion. So in the past 10 years, under the Trudeau government, there has been a doubling, an increase of 100% in military spending. So it's a dramatic increase. And it's gone from 1% of GDP to 1.4% of GDP. Last year at the NATO summit in Washington, D.C., Trudeau made the announcement that Canada was going to increase military spending to 2% of GDP to meet that NATO target by 2032. That will mean a further increase to $81 billion annually for military spending. So he's really set us on a terrible path where it will mean, cuts to social and environmental programs to try to meet that NATO 2% target. The Parliamentary Budget Officer in October of this year released a report that confirmed that military spending will increase to $81 billion by 2032. So under this Trudeau government, foreign policy has been highly militarized. I would like to add that in the past 10 years, Canada has released two defense policies. In 2017, Strong, Secure, and Engaged. And last year, a new defense policy called Our North, Strong, and Free, which have really been become de facto Canada's foreign policy, because Canada, under the Trudeau government, never consulted Canadians on a foreign policy statement. Canada does not have a foreign policy statement, and we just have these defense policies, and they've really become our foreign policy. So what Canada's posture in the world is very militarized, very belligerent, and it's really driven by our close relationship to Washington and to Brussels, very informed by our membership in NATO and NORAD.
Yeah, and when you look at even when they do release sort of foreign policy statements like their so-called Indo-Pacific strategy that they released 2 years ago, the main thing in Indo-Pacific strategy is that we're going to increase the number of Canadian naval vessels that are going to be patrolling near China from 1 to 3. That was the sort of like the big announcement in that strategy. But when you look at its sort of the militarization and talk about this huge increase in military spending, again, if you read the papers or you watch CTV or CBC, there's this notion out there that Canada is this big laggard. We're not spending enough on the military, but actually, as you pointed out, we doubled military spending during Trudeau's time, and they're planning on doubling it again over the next 7 or so years. Can you talk about, and I wouldn't say that we've been in, a time of big mobilization by the anti-war movement, but there was, at least regarding the F-35 purchase, the new fighter jet purchase, there was some campaigning on that issue. But the Trudeau government, while they initially, when they weren't in office, they said that they were, very critical of the F-35, they completely reversed course. And they, despite the fact that there was, quite a bit of opposition to this fighter jet purchase in general, and specifically the F-35, they reversed course and then, in fact, increased the number of F-35s that then the Harper government had initially said they were going to buy. Can you talk a little bit about some of the big military spending purchases of the Trudeau government?
Yes, just before I talk about the F-35s, let me just add to the issue of military spending that, Canada is in no way a laggard on military spending. At our current level of military spending at $41 billion, Canada is ranked 16th highest in the world, according to the CIPRI ranking. And then among the 32 NATO allies, we're ranked 7th highest for military spending on a cash basis. So we're spending a lot on the military. We're spending way too much. And what we need to be doing is cutting military spending and reallocating to the priorities of Canadians. And then also on the Indo-Pacific strategy, again, Canadians weren't consulted on the Indo-Pacific strategy. That came out in November of 2022, 9 months after the United States came out with its Indo-Pacific strategy. And the language and the priorities are very similar. So what Canada is doing in the Indo-Pacific is very much supporting the US militarization of the region and provoking China. And on top of that, Canada has increased arms exports to Taiwan, which is reckless and irresponsible. But in terms of defense procurement, yes, when when Trudeau came in 2015, he ran on a platform that he would not buy the F-35s, but he reversed course, and his defense minister, Anita Anand, in January of 2023, announced that Canada was going to buy more than Harper wanted, 65 F-35s to 88 F-35s, for a purchase cost of $19 billion. But again, the parliamentary budget officer said that the life cycle cost of the F-35s will be over $70 billion. And then a few months later, the federal government announced that we were going to buy a new fleet of strategic refuelers. These are the planes that refuel the fighter aircraft, the military aircraft in the air, and then also, tens of millions of dollars in upgrading the military bases to be able to support the new fleet of F-35. So there have been upgrades to the runways and the hangars in Bagotville, Quebec at the Air Force Base there, at the Air Force Base in Cold Lake, Alberta, and up in Iqaluit. And in August of 2022, in order to support the F-35s and our defense partnership with the United States, $38.6 billion to modernize NORAD, which is really a vast plan to militarize the Arctic. And this is going to, all of this is fossil fuel powered, right? So we are locking ourselves into 3 decades of carbon intensive militarism with these defense procurement, and no member of parliament spoke out, including the NDP defense critic Lindsay Matheson. Nobody spoke out on the climate impacts, the social impacts of these defense purchases. And it's extremely troubling. And it also represents opportunity cost, trade-offs, investing in this militarism and not investing in things like affordable housing, public transit, healthcare, education, the things that Canadians need for their safety and security, or investing in climate resilience. That's something that communities are going to need, because last year when the Trudeau government made these announcements of fighter jets, strategic refuelers, we experienced our hottest year on record and out of control, the worst season for out of control wildfires. So the Trudeau government has not prioritized the needs of Canadians, and instead has prioritized its defense relationship with the United States and really padded the pocket of the weapons manufacturers.
And sort of tied to its military policy, and obviously NATO. Um, Shifting gears a little bit to Eastern Europe. Now, can you talk a little bit about Canada's role in what I think at this point is unarguable, that Canada, the US, NATO helped provoke Russia's invasion. And that's not a defense of Russia's invasion, which I think is horrible and contravenes international law. But there were all these policies that were pursued, including policies that Ottawa pursued under the Trudeau government. Can you talk maybe a little bit about that, about the whole training mission, Operation Unifier, and while there was this low-level proxy war with sort of a civil war in Ukraine, Canada training, Melanie Joly calling on Ukraine to join NATO. Can you talk a little bit about Canada's role in before Russia's invasion in contributing to the tensions?
Yes, there are several ways that Canada helped provoke the war in Ukraine. And just before I give some specifics about that, I would like to mention that the former British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, gave an interview to The Telegraph in November. It's a really important interview. And he said, categorically, that the war in Ukraine is a NATO proxy war. So we should be unequivocal and clear about that. But in terms of the ways that Canada provoked it, Canada supported the violent protests in the Maidan in 2014, and we supported the coup government in February of 2014. It was totally unconstitutional, and in fact, Canada was one of the first countries to recognize the new government, and it was, Harper who made the announcement. The foreign minister at the time, John Baird, was, in Kyiv at the Maidan, supporting the protesters. And then in 2015, well, maybe just in 2014, after the coup government came into power, they displaced the democratically elected government of Viktor Yanukovych, and the coup government was not supported by the Russian-speaking minorities in the east, in Donbass, and in Crimea, and this led to an internal conflict in the country that turned violent. And instead of trying to support the Minsk agreements to end the internal conflict, or try to support a return to democracy in Ukraine, instead Canada launched Operation Unifier in 2015. We brought hundreds of Canadian soldiers to train the Ukrainian militias and turned them into, a new military for Ukraine. And I know from this has been reported in the media, but I've also filed access to information documents, and I have the records that show that Canada knew that the militias that they were training and arming had Nazi ideology. So this is, extremely troubling. The other thing is, in 2015, not only did we launch this training exercise, Operation Unifier, that lasted, until today, and it's been extended. Canada also signed a free trade agreement with Ukraine, but that didn't get uh, in place or enforced until 2017. And in that year, in 2017, is when Canada put Ukraine on the automatic firearms country control list that allowed Canadian companies to get permits to send weapons to Ukraine. So if you look at the Global Affairs Military Goods Exports Report, you can, in like 2019, 2 years later, Canadian companies were exporting millions of dollars of assault weapons, sniper rifles, different types of munition to Ukraine. And then by 2022, it was almost $50 million of weapons had gone to Ukraine. And then in the past 2 years, we've sent an additional $4.5 billion of weapons to Ukraine. Not $1 have we spent in trying to prevent the conflict, to end the conflict, to try to help negotiate it. We very much have wanted this proxy war to take place because it's a way to weaken Russia. And we know from the statement from our Foreign Affairs Minister, Melanie Joly, last year, that she wanted regime change in Russia.
And I should say that like when there were Russian troops on the border, and there's a whole negotiation going on from late 2021 into early 2022 before Russia's invasion. One of the big issues, of course, was NATO expansion. Now, Ukraine was becoming a de facto member of NATO. That's part of what Canada's training mission was about, and the Trudeau government was, doing that from 2015 to 2022 before Russia invaded. But the other thing is that, very provocatively, Melanie Joly was stating repeatedly that Canada wanted Ukraine to join NATO. This is before Russia's invasion, which was one of the major issues, and this was just, contributing to tension totally unnecessarily. As you've mentioned a bit, we sent like about $4.5 billion in weapons over the past, I guess, 3 years. The total package is about $20 billion, about $15 billion in other forms of support. Canada's led the charge on seizing Russian assets and giving those assets to Ukraine. You talked a little bit about it, but can go a little bit further with this question of, not negotiation and getting out of this horrible conflict, and Canada's complete indifference or hostility, really, to that question.
Well, we know that when the conflict started to really escalate, there was a lot of tension in 2021. We were calling on peace groups across the country. We're calling on the federal government to de-escalate, use diplomacy to end the crisis, because we didn't want this to lead to a war. We were very worried that the conditions were being created for a war with Russia, using Ukraine as a proxy. This is something that we were very concerned about in the fall of 2021, and peace groups started to mobilize and, contacting the prime minister offices, MPs, standing committees, and saying, we need to use diplomacy, de-escalate, respect Ukraine's neutrality, because neutrality was in the constitution of Ukraine until about 2019, when NATO put pressure on the Zelensky government to remove that from the constitution. And, of course, we know that if NATO allies had just respected Ukraine's neutrality, we also know that Ukrainians, up until at least 2013, when they were polled, did not want to join NATO, and so there was, there were so many ways, before Russia invaded in February of 2022, that we could have used diplomacy to prevent the conflict. And in fact, in December of 2021, Russia released 2 draft agreements as a basis of negotiation. One of the agreements was between Russia and NATO. The other one was between Russia and the United States. And, we know that the federal government refused to meet with Russia to talk about this. We know that our Minister of Foreign Affairs had an open standing invitation to go to Moscow to discuss this. We know that the Russians were willing to come to Ottawa as well to discuss it, but those negotiations never happened. Instead, Canada followed the United States in not talking with the Russians and trying to use diplomacy. And instead, in January of 2022, more weapons went to Ukraine instead of mediators or diplomats. So this tragic war in Ukraine could have been prevented with Canadian diplomacy. It could have been ended with Canadian diplomacy. Instead, it's been prolonged with Canadian weapons. Many Ukrainians have died, Russians have died, and it didn't have to be this way. There needs to be an accounting of Canadian foreign policy with this, with the next government, and Canadians really need to start questioning, what we've really been doing in Ukraine, and we need a dramatic change in our foreign policy. Canada, like I said, has highly militarized our foreign policy. We're at our lowest level in peacekeeping, our lowest level in diplomacy, and we've really lost our respect in the world. The rest of the world knows where Canada is on all of these conflicts in Ukraine and in Gaza. In both cases, we're supplying Ukraine with weapons, we're supplying Israel with weapons, and we're causing a lot of harm and suffering in the world. And so, Canadians need some introspection about our role in the world and the direction that we want to continue to go in.
And we should note that the Trudeau government lost its bid for a seat on the UN Security Council in 2020, in large part because the rest of the world rejected what you, Tamara, and Owen have detailed, which is this pro military, pro corporate, pro Washington, pro NATO policy that it really is what's driving Canadian foreign policy, and most of the world doesn't like that. Our foreign policy is not being driven by democracy, respect for the rules-based order or international law, or overcoming inequalities, despite the rhetoric we often hear from Trudeau government officials on that. But this is not, unfortunately, just a question of Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau hopefully will be gone in not too long. He's on the cusp of being gone. But it's much more of a structural issue, as I think both of you have detailed, and to overcome that these structural issues, it necessitates democratic participation. It necessitates anti-war activism, mining justice activism, anti-genocide activism with regards to Palestine, anti-war activism, etc. Thanks a lot, Owen and Tamara, for coming on Talking Foreign Policy to discuss 10 years of Justin Trudeau's foreign policy.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Eve.